If your child is dyslexic, one of the best things you can do is to identify it early on. And in this video, I'm going to help you to do that. Hey, my name is Arije. I'm a dyslexic in the field of education studies. And in the first chapter of this video, I'm going to answer the question why it is important to recognize dyslexia early on. To answer this question, I'm going to show you 3 different studies that I found. After we've done that, we're going to look at signs of dyslexia in early childhood. And lastly, we're going to have a look at signs of dyslexia in kindergarten and first grade. From the first study that I would like to show you, we learned that especially undiagnosed dyslexics experience trauma in school. In fact, this study identified that emotional trauma took place in all participants. And it even led to PTSD later in life. By identifying dyslexics early on, we have a chance to prevent this damage. In the next study, early diagnosed dyslexics were compared to late diagnosed dyslexics. And what we see there is that early diagnosed dyslexics have higher perceived general competence, higher perceived academic competence, as well as higher perceived social competence. And lastly, this study from 2017 gives us insight into the effectiveness of interventions. Children who received interventions early in first and second grade made gains relative to controls almost twice that of children receiving interventions in third grade. They also found that the first graders continued to grow at faster rates over the follow-up years. So our takeaway from this study is that the earlier we start interventions, the more effective they become. Before we go into the signs and symptoms of dyslexia, I would like to remind you that dyslexia is genetic. And that means that if either you or your significant other are dyslexic, your child has a 40 to 60% chance of being dyslexic themselves. And remember that back in the day, dyslexia was missed even more often than it is today. The first sign that we would be able to pick up on has to do with language acquisition. Typically, children learn to say their first few words after around 12 months. Now, if this learning process is delayed, then that will be your first sign of dyslexia. The second one has to do with rhymes. Now, rhymes are generally not very easy for dyslexics, so if your child has trouble with simple nursing rhymes like Humpty Dumpty and Jack and Jill, then that would also be an indicator for dyslexia. The third sign would be that your child has difficulties learning the names of letters. And that would go even so far that he or she, for a long time, would not be able to know the letters within his or her own name. Something else that you would be able to notice is the general mispronunciation of words and persistent baby talk. Next up would be... Sorry about that. My neighbors are currently renovating and it has been an absolute nightmare to try to film at the same time. So give me a second to find a different location to film. So now we're going to talk about signs and symptoms in kindergarten and first grade. A typical sign during this time period while reading would be that he or she guesses a lot. We would also see an inability to read single-syllable words like cat, bat, or nap. A concept that's hard to understand for dyslexic children is the fact that a word is made up of different syllables, and that these syllables then come apart, and then that individual syllable is made up of the individual letters and the sounds that they make. In addition to this concept being difficult, dyslexics also struggle associating the right sound with the right letter. And here are 2 little questions for a child that will help you identify if this is something that he or she is struggling with. So I'm going to give you one example. So you would ask your child, which 2 words start with the same sound? Fright, flash, and frame. And then the correct answer would be fright and frame. Also in kindergarten and first grades, rhymes are still an issue. Here are a few word pairs. Some of them rhyme, some of them don't. Can your child identify the ones that rhyme? If not, that would be another indicator for dyslexia. As a parent and as a teacher, it's also important for you to know that when it is time for children to learn to read, dyslexics become aware that they cannot do it as easily as their peers. And with that comes a sense of shame and embarrassment. So these kids might start to hide or start to run away when it is time to read. Ideally, we would recognize dyslexia before it gets to this point. You might have heard that dyslexia sometimes is also referred to as a surprising weakness in otherwise intelligent children. This has to do with the way it has been defined. In the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, we find dyslexia defined as a specific learning disorder, and it states the learning difficulties cannot be accounted for by intellectual difficulties. Meaning dyslexia is a very specific problem that cannot be explained by a lack of intelligence. So due to this, it makes sense to also have a look at the positive side. Your child might have a great imagination, a good ability to grasp things, or great social skills. Many highly intelligent and creative minds in history were actually dyslexics. So if you got value out of this video, then give it a like and share it on your social media so that more people learn to identify dyslexics early on.